Imagine your grandmother leaves you the house she raised your mother in, the house your mother raised you in. You've mowed the lawn, paid the taxes, and kept the lights on for 20 years. It's the only thing of real value your family has ever owned. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, a stranger knocks on your door and tells you they just bought your cousin's share of the property. A cousin you haven't spoken to in a decade. A cousin who lives 3 states away and has never set foot on this land. And now, that stranger is taking you to court to force a sale of the entire property. Your home. The home your grandmother built a life in. And under the law, in many states across this country, there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop it. This isn't some rare legal fluke. Researchers have identified over 500,000 properties just like this one across 44 states with a combined assessed value of $32 billion. The U.S. Department of Agriculture has called it the leading cause of involuntary land loss among Black Americans. And the people losing their land aren't victims of shady deals in back alleys. They're victims of a legal system that was never designed to protect them. To understand how we got here, you need to know what happens when someone dies without a will. When a property owner passes away and there's no legal document spelling out who gets the house, the land goes to their heirs under state law. Every child gets an equal share. But here's the catch. They don't each get a piece of the property. They all own the whole thing together. The legal term is tenants in common, which sounds harmless enough. But what it really means is that nobody has the sole authority to make decisions about the land. You can't get a mortgage on it. You can't get insurance. You can't qualify for disaster relief. You can't even make repairs without the legal consent of every single co-owner. And as generations pass, the number of co-owners grows. 4 children become 13 grandchildren, who become 42 great-grandchildren, who become more people than you can fit in a room. Some of them live on the land. Some of them moved away decades ago. Some of them don't even know they have a legal claim to it. This is what attorneys and land rights advocates call heirs property. And it creates one of the most devastating vulnerabilities in American property law, because any one of those co-owners, no matter how small their share, can sell their interest to an outsider, and that outsider can then go to court and petition for what's called a partition sale, which forces the entire property to be sold at auction. The family members who actually live there, who've maintained the home and paid the taxes for years, often can't afford to outbid a developer or a real estate investor at that auction. So they lose everything: the home, the land, the equity their families spent generations building. Now, you might be thinking this sounds like an edge case, something that happens once in a while. It isn't. Along the coast of North Carolina, in a county called Carteret, a family named Reels learned exactly how ruthless this system can be. In 1911, a man named Mitchell Reels purchased 65 acres of marshy land along Silver Dollar Road in Beaufort, North Carolina. He was 1 generation removed from slavery. He farmed watermelons, beets, and peas on that land. Churches held tent revivals along the waterfront. During the Jim Crow era, it was the only beach in the county where Black families were allowed to swim. When Mitchell Reels died in 1970, he didn't leave a will. Like many Black Americans of his generation, he didn't trust the courts. He assumed that not having a will would keep the land in the family. In reality, it did the opposite. The land became heirs' property, and every one of Mitchell's descendants inherited an undivided interest in it. Over the years, a distant relative sold their share. The land changed hands. A real estate investor bought the waterfront plot site unseen in 1986 to divide and sell. But two of Mitchell's descendants, brothers Melvin Davis and LeCurtis Reels, refused to leave. They had built a house on that land. They ran a shrimping business. They had lived there their entire lives. In 2011, a judge ruled that the brothers were in civil contempt for refusing to vacate the property. They were ordered to tear down their structures and never return. When they refused, they were locked in the Carteret County Jail. They stayed there for nearly 8 years. Melvin Davis and LeCurtis Reels were never charged with a crime, never convicted of anything. They were simply two men who refused to walk away from the land their great-grandfather had bought a century earlier. According to reporting from ProPublica, they became two of the longest-serving inmates for civil contempt in United States history. When they were finally released in 2019, the condition was simple. They could never set foot on their family's land again. Melvin was 72 years old. LeCurtis was 61. The Reels brothers' story is extreme, but the pattern behind it is not. A historian of the North Carolina coast told ProPublica that you cannot talk to a Black family who owned land in those counties without finding a story where they feel their land was taken through legal trickery. And the numbers back that up. In Carteret County alone, 42% of partition cases involving heirs' property affected Black families, despite Black residents making up only 6% of the population. But North Carolina is just one piece of this. The crisis stretches across the entire southeastern coast, and nowhere is it more visible than Hilton Head Island in South Carolina. Before the golf courses and gated communities, before the luxury resorts with plantation in their names, Hilton Head was home to the Gullah Geechee people, descendants of enslaved West Africans who were brought to work rice and cotton plantations along the coast. When the Civil War ended and plantation owners fled, the Gullah stayed. They bought land, built homes, and created a culture with its own language, spiritual practices, and agricultural traditions that has survived for 150 years. Then, the developers arrived. Starting in the 1950s and accelerating through the decades that followed, wealthy investors bought up enormous tracts of coastal land and turned Hilton Head into a multi-million-dollar tourist destination. The Gullah families who had been there for generations were pushed aside. Their land was taken through partition sales, lost to skyrocketing property taxes, or sold for a fraction of its value after developers tracked down distant heirs who had no connection to the community and bought their shares for a few $1,000s. The results have been devastating. In areas where the Gullah once made up 90% or more of the population, they now account for as little as 10%. The vast acreage of farmland and beachfront property once owned by Gullah families plummeted to fewer than 1,000 acres. Every fall in Beaufort County, investors attend an auction where they can bid on tax-delinquent properties. For families already stretched thin, a single missed tax payment can mean losing land that has been in the family since Reconstruction. Josephine Wright was 93 years old when developers filed a lawsuit trying to force her off land her family had owned on Hilton Head since the Civil War. A formerly enslaved ancestor named Dennis Allen purchased the first patches of what is now the family's 31 acres back in 1897. Wright faced intimidation, trespassing, and property damage. Her granddaughter described finding snakes near their bedroom window, flat tires, and debris left on their cars, all because they refused to sell. The broader scale of this crisis is staggering. Between 1900 and 2000, Black Americans lost an estimated 80% of the land they had acquired, roughly 12 to 14 million acres, according to research published by the Union of Concerned Scientists. That includes nearly 90% of farmland once owned by black farmers, and it is not limited to the rural South. Heirs Property is found in Appalachia, on tribal lands out west, and in cities like Philadelphia and New York. One former co-chair of the American Bar Association's Property Preservation Task Force called it the worst problem you never heard of. But people have heard of it, and they're fighting back. In 2010, the Uniform Law Commission approved the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act. The law was designed to put safeguards in place before a forced sale can happen. It requires that family members be notified if an outsider tries to buy an heir's share, and it gives them the right to buy that share at fair market value before a developer can swoop in. It also requires an independent appraisal so investors cannot lowball families. And it tells judges to prioritize physically dividing the land among heirs rather than forcing a sale, while also considering the historical and sentimental value of the property. As of now, the Act has been adopted in over 20 states. South Carolina passed its version in 2016, but some states, including North Carolina, where the Reals brothers lost everything, have been slow to act. Organizations like the Center for Heirs Property Preservation in South Carolina have cleared more than 200 titles for families, protecting land valued at $14 million. They have mapped out 100,000 acres of heirs property in the state. But they have been careful not to share those maps publicly because, as one of their leaders put it, otherwise they would be a shopping catalog for developers, and the problem does not stop growing. New heirs property is being created every single day. The story of heirs property is the story of what happens when the law fails to protect the people who need it most. Families who maintained their land, paid their taxes, and raised their children in homes built by their ancestors, only to have it all taken away because of a legal technicality that most of them never knew existed. If you own property or expect to inherit it someday, the single most important thing you can do is make sure there is a will. A legal, documented will that spells out exactly who gets what. It is a simple step, but it is the difference between your family keeping the home you built and a stranger knocking on their door one Tuesday afternoon. If this story hit you the way it hit me, you will want to see the video on screen right now. It goes even deeper into how these systems work and the people trying to change them. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.